Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Monday, November 25th. I'm Elizabeth Arcalian. In the November election, California residents faced a choice: approve new funding for school infrastructure or not.
68% of those bond measures have passed, and that kind of speaks to voters, communities, seeing the need for this bond money to be used in the community.
Coming up, we break down the vote on bonds in the Central Valley. But first, today's headlines. Governor Gavin Newsom's traveling to Kern County this morning. His press office says he'll be highlighting regional efforts on jobs and the economy. This follows a stop in Fresno last week where Newsom launched his, quote, California Jobs First program, which aims to boost the economy in areas like the Valley where investment is lacking. A Fresno company is recalling a supply of raw milk after the bird flu virus was detected in at least one sample. The LA Times reports that the sample from the company Raw Farm was collected in Santa Clara County last week. Over the weekend, health officials recommended that retailers who sell the milk pull it from shelves. The company said the recall applies to all quarter and half-gallon-sized milk products produced on November 9th, with an expiration date of November 27th. So far, there have been no reports of illnesses tied to this case. Health officials say they're treating a Fresno County resident who was recently exposed to rabies. They believe the resident was bitten by a bat in Merced County. Health departments from both counties are currently working to notify anyone who might have been exposed to that patient. Rabies is a serious disease that's almost always fatal unless a person's treated before symptoms appear. It is transmitted through the saliva of infected animals like bats and skunks. The ground beneath our feet is sinking at alarming rates. A new report from Stanford University blames groundwater overpumping. KVPR's Joshua Yeager has the details.
The report from Stanford says the rate of sinking is nearly an inch per year. That may not sound like much, but researchers say it has big impacts on the land and its ability to hold groundwater, not to mention the valley's economy. The land sinking is known as subsidence, and it's already caused visible damage to critical infrastructure, like the Bryant-Kern Canal. Millions have been spent to repair it. Researchers estimate valley aquifers would require billions of gallons of water to offset the sinking. But the need for groundwater above the surface to feed thirsty crops, particularly during drought years, competes with the need to store it. The study's authors say it will take valley-wide action to stop subsidence and restore groundwater balance. For KVPR News, I'm Joshua Yeager.
State Assembly member Joaquin Arambula is choosing not to run for a sixth and final term in the legislature. Instead, he says he'll run for a seat on the Fresno City Council. Arambula lives in Fresno's District 3, which is currently represented by Miguel Arias. Arambula currently represents Assembly District 31, but will term out at the end of 2026. It's unclear who might run to replace Arambula in the State Assembly. He was first elected in 2016. New rules are coming for street vendors in the city of Fresno. Last week, the City Council approved new rules that include requiring a business license and keeping areas around booths trash-free. The vote didn't come without controversy. Vendors voiced opposition to some of the new provisions and negotiated to reduce some of the potential fines for ordinance violations. The City Council will finalize its new rules next month. They would take effect 6 months after approval.
Support for Central Valley Daily comes from Fresno Mazda, part of the Prieto Automotive family, with special holiday financing deals on select models through the end of the year at the new showroom on Blackstone and Barstow. Information at myfresnomazda.com.
And now to our main story. This past election, the Central Valley had a lot to decide on besides the presidential race, especially when it comes to funding for public schools. Across the valley, over 24 local school bond measures were up for a vote. Altogether, the bonds were requesting over $2.5 billion for school upgrades. Of those, 25 have passed, and 2 more are still too close to call. Voters also approved statewide ballot measure Proposition 2, which authorizes $10 billion in bonds to upgrade K-12 schools and community colleges. To get a deeper understanding of what all of this means for local schools, KVPR's Carrie Klein spoke with Lasherica Thronton. She's an education reporter for the nonprofit news site EdSource. Thornton first discussed what the next steps look like for statewide Proposition 2.
I will say with Prop 2, it's not just the $10 billion. There were some changes when voters approved it. There are some things that are going to have to be changed and that are going to have to be implemented now that voters have said yes to it. So that implementation process in and of itself, the state is going to have to set some rules and regulations for those things. And that's just going to take time.
Interesting. What kinds of changes?
So, like, for example, there are going to be like some additional grant dollars really to serve as like an incentive for districts to include certain things in their projects. So like TK classrooms, lead and water, those are things that are now part of Prop 2. There are changes as far as, whereas in the matching part of the grant, whereas districts used to get like, let's say 60% for this, they can now get up to 65%. So that's another change. There's some small school district assistance that's now part of Prop 2.
And so at a very broad level, this proposition means that school districts that passed school bond measures of their own will be able to get even more money from the state, correct?
Yes.
How does that process work?
Districts can have really 2 categories where they can apply for funding, so to speak. It can either be for like new construction, that would mean, you proving that there's not enough space, classroom space for you to even educate the students that you're anticipated to have in a few years. The other one would be quote unquote modernization or, in other words, repairs and upgrades. And that kind of clock starts at when buildings are 25 years old. So those are the 2 categories that districts can, number one, apply for the funds. Their first step, districts have to put together a plan that has to go before, number one, the Division of the State Architecture. So the plan also has to go before the Department of Education. After that step, it has to go before another entity, which is like the funding entity. And obviously, I guess just in even thinking about that process, right? When districts are applying, it is a first come, first served basis. So I think for a lot of people, a question is, well, what about smaller districts who don't, maybe have enough resources or have the department or have the support that, let's say, bigger districts have to really be able to hit the ground running and planning and submitting those applications? Something that Prop 2 did, small districts with 2,500 or less students, they're going to actually get like some planning grant support to be able to really help in the process of either hiring somebody or just getting help in saying we need help with the planning part of it in and of itself.
It's important to note that voters approved over 20 school bond measures worth nearly $2 billion just here in the San Joaquin Valley. How does that compare to bonds approved in elections past?
Overall, I will say I kind of looked at like the state overall as far as years past, and it does seem to be kind of the same. It's kind of back at in previous years as far as like how the state is passing. It seems to be at the same thing. I will say that something that I noticed though for the Central Valley, it seems like a lot of the bond measures here, it wasn't like a close margin, right? So you had Fresno Unified and Central Unified with literally over 63% of voters saying yes to these bond measures. And again, that's not everybody, but for Fresno Unified, a $500 million bond and a $109 million bond in Central Unified, for so many voters to say yes, that I think that's saying a lot. And then again, even when you look at statewide, the Prop 2, and then just even looking at, not just Prop 2, looking at all of the local bonds across the state, we know there were 252 K-12 bond measures. There were 15 local community college measures. Out of all of those 267 across the state, early preliminary numbers from the election results show that 68% of those bond measures have passed. And that kind of speaks to voters, communities, seeing the need for this bond money to be used in the community. And I mean, overall across the state as well. So
Now, 6 bond measures didn't pass in our area, including a $26 million bond by Exeter Unified School District. There are still a handful of measures that are too close to call right now and did not, either win or lose by a really large margin. So with the ones that have failed, what do the options look like for district officials? Would they be able to try again in the next election? What are their options there?
Yeah, obviously that is the most obvious approach or option that districts have, because they can, again, just go to their voters again next time come around. That may not be the most ideal because that is such a long time away, and they do obviously have all of these needs. But, I mean, just depending on the district, and this isn't the case for everybody, but maybe a district maybe their budget will allow them to be able to put money towards some things until the next election cycle. Again, maybe depending on the district, because Prop 2 does have like a financial hardship caveat to it. Like maybe the district will meet the eligibility for that aspect of it. Like there are other options out there. It's just going to honestly depend. I hate to give a broad answer like that, but it's just going to honestly depend on the school district, what their needs are, their property values, how many students they have. It just depends on all of those aspects and looking at what districts need to do.
That was KVPR's Carrie Klein speaking with EdSource reporter Lasherica Thronton. One of the bonds still too close to call is Measure Q. It proposes $698 million in bond money to upgrade facilities and programs at campuses with the State Center Community College District. The district oversees several community colleges, including in Reedley, Fresno, Clovis, and Madera. Measure Q needs 55% of the vote to pass, and as of now has 55.41% of yes votes. A few thousand votes from the district's area still need to be counted. And that does it for today. Thanks so much for listening. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
No matter what happens in Washington, the NPR Politics Podcast is here for you. For the latest news, insights, and analysis from the election and beyond, listen to the NPR Politics Podcast.